There's a photograph from January 1968 that shouldn't exist. Big Ben, frozen solid. The clock face buried under snow so heavy, the hands physically couldn't move. They stopped at 6:28 in the morning and stayed there for nearly 4 hours. People walking across Westminster Bridge that day just stood there, staring up at it. The clock that had survived the Blitz, that had marked every significant moment in British history, defeated by weather. And if you're thinking that sounds dramatic, that's because you don't know what came next, because the frozen clock was just the beginning. What happened in the 2 weeks that followed would become Scotland's worst natural disaster on record. 20 people dead in a single night, entire neighborhoods destroyed, and a storm that arrived so fast with so little warning that families were killed in their sleep before they even knew what was happening. This is the story of the winter of 1968, the winter nobody talks about, the winter that taught Britain it was never as safe as it thought. It started the way most disasters do, and people were just getting back to normal life after the holidays. Cold, yes, gray, always, but nothing unusual, just typical British winter gloom, coats and scarves, and the occasional complaint about the heating bill. Then, on January 8th, the weather changed. Snow began falling across southern and central England, not the light, romantic kind you see on Christmas cards. Heavy snow, relentless snow, driven by strong southeast winds that just wouldn't stop. By the morning of January 9th, much of England was buried. Snowdrifts hit 3 meters in some places. Roads vanished completely. Railways blocked. Entire villages cut off from the outside world. In mid-Wales, they measured 30 centimeters of level snow. Not drifts, level. And in London, something happened that made people realize this wasn't normal. Big Ben stopped. The iconic clock, the thing that represented British reliability more than anything else in the country, stood frozen. Snow had piled up on the clock faces, jamming the massive hands in place. For nearly 4 hours, it stayed silent. No chimes, no movement, just this eerie, motionless gray dial hanging over Westminster. People who saw it described this strange feeling of wrongness, like seeing a heart stop beating. If Big Ben could freeze, what else was at risk? The blizzard brought life to a near halt. Trains froze on the tracks. Buses abandoned their routes halfway through. Schools closed. Factories shut. Families woke up to find their windows iced over from the inside, their milk frozen solid on the doorstep, and streets piled so high with snow that cars just disappeared beneath white mounds. This wasn't inconvenient. This was dangerous. People who had to go out described the wind as sharp enough to cut through any coat. Snowdrifts blocked entire roads. Drivers got trapped in their cars for hours, some for an entire night. A few walked miles through waist-deep snow just to reach help. But Britain, being Britain, responded the only way it knew how, with stubbornness and teeth. Neighbors dug each other out. Strangers helped push cars. The postman still turned up, even if he couldn't actually reach every door. Life slowed, but it didn't stop. And just as people began to recover, to dig out their driveways and get the trains running again, just as they started to breathe normally and think the worst was over, something else was happening. Something nobody was paying attention to out in the Atlantic. A storm was forming. On January 13th, meteorologists spotted a low pressure system near Bermuda. Nothing unusual about that. The Atlantic produces these systems constantly. This one looked weak, manageable. It drifted north toward the Azores, and forecasters tracked it the way they always did, expecting it to follow the usual patterns: weaken, dissipate, disappear. But this storm didn't behave normally. In less than 24 hours, it exploded. The pressure dropped by 50 mil. That's meteorological language for absolute monster. The kind of deepening that creates hurricane-force winds. The kind that meteorologists see maybe once or twice in their entire careers. It raced across the Atlantic at terrifying speed, heading straight for the UK. But here's the thing. The forecasters expected it to pass to the north, way up above Scotland, missing the mainland entirely. A close call, but nothing to worry about. They were wrong. On the evening of January 14th, the storm changed course. It turned east, directly toward the central belt of Scotland, directly toward Glasgow. And by the time anyone realized what was coming, by the time the new trajectory became clear, it was too late to do anything about it. Too late to warn people properly. Too late to evacuate. Too late to prepare. Most people went to bed that night with no idea what was about to happen. January 15th, 1968. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, families asleep, everything quiet and still. Then the wind arrived. It hit Glasgow first, winds screaming through the streets at over 100 miles per hour. Hurricane force. In an urban area, something Scotland had never experienced in recorded history. And the sound, people who survived it described the sound as something they'll never forget. Like a freight train, like a bomb going off, like the world-ending roofs were torn off buildings like they were made of paper. Chimney stacks, 3 tons of solid brick and masonry, ripped from rooftops and crashed through tenement buildings, smashing through floors, all the way to the basement. Windows exploded inward. Walls collapsed. Trees snapped like matchsticks. The entire city plunged into complete darkness as power lines came down. A Glasgow police spokesman, when asked to describe it the next day, could only say 2 words: absolute havoc. But those words don't capture what it was really like. They don't capture the families who woke up to nightmare scenes. In Dumbarton Road, a mother and her 4-year-old daughter, visiting from England for a funeral, were killed in their sleep when a chimney fell through the roof. Next door, another mother and her 10-year-old daughter died the same way. It took rescuers 12 hours to find their bodies in the rubble. A pregnant nurse lost her life when masonry crashed through her flat. A 5-year-old girl in Anderson. A man in Charing Cross. A woman in Cross Hill. The death toll climbed through the night. 20 people died across Scotland, 9 of them in Glasgow alone. But death wasn't the only horror. When dawn broke on January 15th, people stumbled out of their homes into scenes they couldn't process. Streets filled with rubble. Cars crushed beneath fallen masonry. Lampposts twisted and buckled like they'd been hit by artillery. The air thick with dust and the smell of broken buildings. Over 300 houses in Glasgow completely destroyed. 70,000 homes damaged, half of the city's council houses. In Edinburgh, the famous Scott Monument lost one of its towering pinnacles. Churches collapsed, schools destroyed, factories flattened. The damage was compared to the Clyde Bank Blitz, the night during World War II when German bombers devastated the area. Except this time there were no bombers, no enemy, just wind. And it wasn't just Glasgow. Out in the countryside, the Forestry Commission reported 8,000 hectares of woodland destroyed. Over 1,000 mature trees downed in the Central Belt alone. On the River Clyde, 7 ships sank. Further out in the rough seas, an oil drilling rig called Seaquest was set adrift. The storm's fury reached all the way to Denmark, where 8 more people died. Scotland's worst natural disaster since records began, and nobody had seen it coming. But this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable, because the disaster didn't end on January 15th. In the weeks that followed, another 30 people died. Roofers, builders, ordinary men trying to repair damaged homes. They fell from roofs, were crushed by collapsing walls, killed by the very buildings they were trying to fix. 700 people were left homeless immediately. Thousands more lived in houses with holes in the roof, covered by flapping tarpaulin that did almost nothing against the wind and rain. Hospitals gave up mattresses so families could sleep in school halls. Churches opened their doors. Community centers became shelters. And the government's response? Harold Wilson's Labour government offered an interest-free loan of £500,000, not a grant, for damage estimated at £30 million. To put that in perspective, the year before, when the Torrey Canyon oil tanker sank off Land's End, the government gave £1.5 million immediately, no questions asked. But Scotland, 400 miles from London, apparently wasn't newsworthy enough. There's a photograph from January 1968 that shouldn't exist. Big Ben, frozen solid. The clock face buried under snow so heavy, the hands physically couldn't move. They stopped at 6:28 in the morning and stayed there for nearly 4 hours. People walking across Westminster Bridge that day just stood there, staring up at it. The clock that had survived the Blitz, that had marked every significant moment in British history, defeated by weather. And if you're thinking that sounds dramatic, that's because you don't know what came next, because the frozen clock was just the beginning. What happened in the 2 weeks that followed would become Scotland's worst natural disaster on record. 20 people dead in a single night. Entire neighborhoods destroyed. And a storm that arrived so fast, with so little warning, that families were killed in their sleep before, They even knew what was happening. This is the story of the winter of 1968. The winter nobody talks about. The winter that taught Britain it was never as safe as it thought. It started the way most disasters do, quietly.